What do you think about suffering? Is suffering a good thing? Shouldn't we all suffer? Is suffering bad? Well, this week in the gospel, we've got the continuation of the story of Peter saying that you are the Messiah, you're the Christ, you're the one that we've been waiting for. And no sooner has Peter said that Jesus says, okay, you got it. I'm going to tell you what's going to happen. I have to go to Jerusalem and I'm going to suffer at the hands of the scribes and the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and they're going to put me to death. And then I'll be raised from the dead 3 days later. But Peter doesn't hear that. Peter hears, I'm going to suffer and die. And he clearly does not truly understand the nature of who and what the Messiah is all about. Because no sooner has Peter said, God forbid you should suffer and die. And Jesus says to Peter, get behind me, Satan. Now, that sounds really harsh, but Satan is actually an Arabic term for obstacle, adversary, all right? It doesn't mean like the devil with the horns and the pitchfork. No. So he says, get behind me, Satan. You're thinking as men do, not as God does. Now that's very interesting because Peter is upset because Jesus has just described a suffering Messiah. He said, you're the Messiah, and Jesus says, bingo, you got it. And then he says, I'm going to be a suffering Messiah. I'm going to suffer and die. Now, in our culture, that is verboten. You don't need to suffer. As a cancer patient, I have learned that I can get almost any drug I want to take away my pain and suffering. And that's good at times. I can tell you anything from marijuana to opiates to you name it, they'll give me just about anything to take away my pain and suffering, and that's called palliative care, all right? Now, some people, and we've seen this in our culture, believe that, you should never suffer and then you should be able to die on your own terms. And that's why we have so many states now that have voted in assisted suicide. Canada is really bad. They've got this medical assistance in dying. And, I know a priest that was going in for hip surgery and they asked him 3 times if he wanted to check out. And he just was recovering from hip surgery. Does he want to just, take the plunge and say farewell to the world? Because that's how bad it is in Canada now. But it has grown out of this idea that we should not suffer. And I know this is going to be very controversial for a lot of people, but because you have to really think about this concept that Jesus is saying, I am going to suffer and I'm going to die. And if you think about it, if the Son of God is going to suffer and he's going to die, what's it for the disciples? Do you think we're going to get out of it by not suffering and not dying? No, because where the teacher has gone, the students follow after. And so we have to really think about this week, what do we think of suffering? What good is suffering? But we as a Catholic Church in our spirituality, we have written over and over again the value of suffering, that our suffering can become our prayer. Now, I don't like suffering any more than the next guy, but I do know that my suffering can be turned into prayer. And I can suffer and I can say to God, let my suffering alleviate the suffering of someone else. That could be my prayer too. There are plenty of saints in the history of the church that have done that. So there is value in suffering. Suffering is not a good thing in itself, but there's value in it. Should I say everyone should suffer and die a horrible death? No, that's not what I'm saying. But that's the challenge for you and me this week. Do we want to avoid suffering at all costs? I know some people that get like a little teeny tiny headache. Oh my God, I need like 6 aspirin. And they're like taking pills. It's like we live in a culture where it's like, if I stub my toe, oh my God, I need a pill. I need a pill. I need a pill. And that's the culture we live in. But that's not the culture that God created. That's not the culture that Jesus speaks about in the gospel. That's the culture that Peter wants. And Jesus says, get behind me, Satan. You're thinking as men do, not as God does. So there is value in suffering, but we have to think about that. And more importantly, pray over it. The value of suffering in a world that wants to get rid of it.